Okay, so let's begin. People are still joining. If you guys don't mind to mute your microphones, so we'll have Q&A in the end, but for now it's best to for not to be any interference. So welcome everyone to this edition of Sardines, the Lisbon Ruby and Ruby on Rails meetup. I'm Tiago, and I will be your host for the next hour or something like that. This is our 12th edition, and it's the first hybrid one. So we've never done this. I hope it will go okay. We'll have around 30 people in Zoom and around 10, around 10 over here in our office. Let's see how this goes. First of all, thank you for coming today. We decided to do this hybrid edition of Sardines because some of you said that you're missing real life in-person events. But there were also other people that said that they like to have the meetup via Zoom, through Zoom. So we thought, why not do the best of both worlds and have people join us on Zoom and have people join us in the office. So we invited the speaker to join us today. And he didn't know about the format before accepting our invitation, so he accepted it anyway after we told him it was like this. So thank you, Chris. His name is Chris Oliver. So welcome to Sardines, Chris. I'm going to change the view over here just so we can see you better. Okay. Thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for having me.
And so Chris is the CEO of GoRails. Just to give some context, GoRails is a platform in the community for people that want to learn more about Ruby on Rails. That's pretty much it, right, Chris? You want to talk about a little bit about GoRails and how it started, how it's going?
Sure. Yeah, I started GoRails back in like 2014. What's that? Can you hear me?
It was just some noise. We can hear you. Started GoRails around 2014.
Okay. Yeah. So I started doing screencasts and, have been doing that ever since. That grew into a pretty big community and 400 some videos now. And then Hatchbox, which is a little Rails hosting service. So you can bring your own server and we'll configure it and help you deploy apps to it. And Jumpstart, which is a Rails template that has some of the stuff we're talking about today, like Hotwire and ActionMailbox and all of that, like wired up and ready to go. So you can go grab that and build like a SaaS app or some other business idea that you have. You can kind of jumpstart that and go focus on building your product instead of building authentication and accounts and billing and all that stuff. So GoRails is kind of several things. Yeah, that's the goal, right? So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the talk today is going to be about real-time apps with Hotwire and ActionMailbox. I think that the title there just spoiled it for everyone. That's okay. So I hope you all enjoy it, and if you can start, Chris, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So as the title suggests, we're gonna walk through like the high level of how to approach building an app like a customer support tool and take advantage of Hotwire, which is now going to be the default in Rails 7. And the first alphas of that came out yesterday. So this is going to be something that like any brand new Rails app will be using out of the box. And then we're going to talk about ActionMailbox as well, because there's some really cool stuff that I don't think people know about enough. So I want to, kind of showcase that as well. So first thing is Hotwire. This is the evolution of TurboLinks, basically. And what that means is instead of TurboLinks just handling your link clicking, it also handles forms and also does like iframe type things and real-time updates to your page, which is awesome. So This is now going to be default in Rails 7, and it also provides some of that stuff that that TurboLinks originally kind of promised, which was you can easily build an iOS or an Android app that wraps your Rails app in a web browser on mobile, and you can intercept and do native things when you want. That never really got to where it needed to be until Hotwire came out, because now we can do a lot better things like error handling and stuff like that that are built in, and broadcasting real-time updates to the page. So then the other thing that I wanted to cover was ActionMailbox. And this is, if you're not familiar, it helps you take an inbound email and process that, so that you can actually, take the email and save it in your app, maybe as a comment or something else. And this is a really useful feature of Rails that I feel like more people should be using and probably don't realize, it can be as useful as it is. So the way the ActionMailbox kind of works is you send an email to an address that gets processed by some service like SendGrid or Postmark, and they convert that email from SMTP to a webhook that sends to your Rails app, and then ActionMailbox processes that for you. So the third thing we're going to talk about is Action Text, which allows you to save rich text in your Rails app. And this can do even like advanced embeds, like uploading images with active storage. But you can also do user mentions, and actually reference literally any model in your Rails app, which is super useful. So if you've ever wondered how like GitHub can reference commits or pull requests or issues when you're writing a comment, it's kind of similar to this. And one of those examples that we're going to talk about is replying by email, which is super useful and something that I feel like is, most apps should eventually add for some, likely there's some feature that could use this. And we can use this to process emails through ActionMailbox. When you just hit reply on GitHub, they basically do the same thing we're going to talk about here. Same goes for Hey World. This is Hey's blog platform, and you just write an email to world@hey.com, and they take the subject and the body and publish it as a blog post. So you can imagine they could build this with ActionMailbox as well. So they just grab the email and then save that as a new blog post instead of a comment or something. So one other thing that's actually really useful that I don't think there's not a lot of good blog posts or anything on this, but the list unsubscribe header, when you send out an email, can include a URL or an email address to mail to. And Gmail, Hey, and other email providers will display like an unsubscribe link here. And when you click that, it will actually send an email to the mail to, or link you to the unsubscribe link. And that's how the automatic unsubscribe stuff works. So you can actually use ActionMailbox to have your notifications with an unsubscribe link right here built in, which is super handy. So we're going to talk about this in the context of building a customer support app, which kind of has all of these features that we're going to be talking about. You probably want to be able to see a new reply in real time. You want to see that a coworker replied in real time, that maybe the ticket was closed in real time, and all of those updates can get published through Hotwire. And all of this can interact with ActionMailbox and probably save all this text as active or action text in your database. So that's kind of a good example that can showcase all of these at once. So you can kind of just lay out your models that you might need for an app like this. You need a conversation, of many conversations between our company employees and customers, and so a conversation has many posts. There may be a primary recipient to that, which is one of our contacts or our customers. So we can have a contact model that doesn't have to be customers. It could be prospects that someone's interested in, our business, and they send us a support request asking, do we do X, Y, or Z feature? So we can end up creating a post model that can reference either a user who's like our employee doing support work or a contact. So we can make that polymorphic, and then we can use action text for the post body so that we can take advantage of all the nice features there. And the message ID column on the post model is useful for us to keep track of the email identifiers themselves. So every email will have its own ID, and this is useful for including in your email headers so that your email client knows that this is a reply to this previous message. And that is how they kind of sort and thread your emails as they come in. So we're going to most importantly, have that field in our models so we can look up things and make sure we, don't have duplicates of a message or whatever as well. So let's talk about Hotwire. Hotwire has quite a lot to it. Turbo now has way more features than just clicking on links. One of those is that it can automatically subscribe and process action cable messages for you. So the way to set it up is you say we have a turbo stream from tag on the page, and you can give it a channel name or an object, and it will generate a channel name from that. In this case, we have a conversation, and it will generate the channel name for that conversation, which will be unique, and I believe even a signed ID as well, so it can't be tampered with. But what this will do is basically tell Action Cable, hey, listen to any new messages on this conversation. So when a new message comes in, we can then insert that onto the page automatically. Line 12 down here has the div with the ID of posts, and we have all of the posts rendered out inside of there. So the backend can broadcast a new post, and it will look for the posts div on the page, and we can either like prepend it at the top if you want to build something like Twitter where the new stuff comes at the top, or you can put it at the bottom. Siri's interrupting. So this is one of those features of Turbo it's not just about links on the client side anymore. It's now like a full conversation back and forth between the client and the server, which is really nice. So let's talk about how we could broadcast those messages to the client. Basically, when we set up that turbo stream from, we can have the backend say anytime a new post is created, updated, or deleted, we can broadcast that change to the conversation. So on line 9 here, we're saying broadcast to, which sets up several callbacks, and I'll show that in a minute. But then we have the symbol of conversation, which is actually referencing the association, belongs to conversation. So just like we had on the client side, we're streaming from, or we're listening for changes on the conversation. And then the backend here says, let's send changes on that same conversation. So they're wired up together, and they'll be able to talk to each other. So this broadcast to looks a little bit like this. It's probably changed a little bit since then, but this method basically sets up 3 callbacks. You have a create, update, and destroy. And each one of those, the first one adds a new record in whenever you create a post. It inserts it into the page or broadcasts the change. And then update says, hey, if this is on the page, let's just replace it and update it with the latest version. And destroy removes it from the page. And we can use these broadcasts anywhere on the back end of our Rails app. So you can do this in your models, you can do this in your controllers, or wherever you might want to put this, as long as you include like the broadcastable module. And this is just a helper that's mostly useful inside of your models, but it allows you to, send changes over the action cable WebSocket. So the other place we can do turbo stream events is when we make a request from the client. So we submit a form, we click a link, or we do something like that. So when we create a post in our app, we can respond with a TurboStream event. And this example here is going to create a new post. And the line I highlighted here is going to replace the form on the page with a new version of that form. So you type in your message and we submit that to the server. Turbo is going to package up that form and send it as a TurboStream format by default, which will fall back to HTML if you don't have a format.turbostream response here. So we do, and this is going to replace the form on the page, and it's going to send it back in the response to the request instead of broadcasting it over Action Cable. So this will replace the form with the empty version, but on line 34, we do the exact same thing. And we've already checked our post for errors. So that version will render the same form partial, but it will include the errors. So we'll be able to clear it out. If we create a new post and it was successful, we clear out that form and it's still there at the bottom of the page. But if there are errors, we render those errors. And it's just a very minor improvement to the basic Rails scaffold create that you're used to. So each of these TurboStream broadcasts that happen from the models or the responses from submitting your post form have the same format. They look like this, and you can actually insert these onto the page with JavaScript if you wanted. It doesn't have to be from Rails. These are TurboStream tags. So they have a couple options. They have the action, which says replace, update, remove, append, prepend. There's a bunch of different actions you can take. And they have a target or targets. And this one here says replace the form element with this template. So there's a template and everything inside of that is what is actually replaced on the page. So we just render out our new form with our inputs and everything, and that's it. We're good to go. So the way this looks is if we create a post with an empty body, it runs the validations and replaces the form for us with the errors automatically. We never left the page. It didn't refresh anything. The TurboStream event just modified that piece of the page. So we can fill out an actual message and create the post, and it's going to show up. But the way that this happened here was two things happened. We created the post in the database, which actually triggered the broadcast to render the message partial with the hello and wave in it. And that happened from the Action Cable stream that we stream from. And that all happened with a background job that rendered that partial and sent it to the page. And then the form got replaced with no errors by the Ajax fetch request that Turbo made to submit this form. So we actually got TurboStream actions from two different places here. And the way that we did that, we could have inserted this message right away, but by doing the broadcast, we can send that message to everybody who's looking at this page. So the Action Cable stream gets connected whenever you visit this page immediately. So that's really nice because now we can show messages in real time in multiple browsers. But we don't want to do that for the form because the form would clear out someone else trying to type a reply, and that would be bad. So that's why we do a TurboStream broadcast for the model, but not a broadcast for the form. We just do that in the response. So that allows us to do a pretty cool little form here. Now let's talk about actually creating these posts with ActionMailbox. If someone emails us, we want to be able to create a message very similarly to how we just did. So when we send out an email, we want them to be able to reply to that. So let's take a look at an email. And I have never really spent a ton of time digging into the weeds of emails and the multi-part stuff and the headers and all that stuff that's available. And I think a lot of Rails developers don't. You set up your mailers and stuff, and you define your mailers, who it goes to, and their subjects and the content, and you're kind of done most of the time. But there's a lot you can do with emails. So this one, for example, has an image in it. And we're going to go and explore how that looks in a raw email. So emails have a section of headers, just like we do with HTTP. And you'll see those at the top. You've got your MIME version, your date, your message ID. That's the message ID that we added to the post model. And we talked about that before. We'll talk about it more later when we get to writing the code for Action Mailbox. But you can see we, have a subject, our to and from addresses. Notably, our from has a name, and there's greater than, less than brackets around the email address, but our to is just an email address. Now, the next section here with content type is where emails get more complex. They have multiple chunks of the email, and they can be plain text, HTML, a PNG, a GIF, whatever other attachments someone might add to their email. So this is at the top here, lines 12 through like 22 or 23 are basically the plain text version of this email. It has hello world in there, and it says, hey, this is where the logo.png should be. But in plain text, you can't embed an image. So it's just a little placeholder. And sort of the same thing goes for the HTML version you see below that. There's actually an image source in there on line 27 at the very end. It kind of wraps around. It says image source, and we have this CID colon string, but not an actual URL to the image like you would expect in a web page. And that's referencing another portion or a part of this email where our logo is actually just raw uploaded in this content. So that looks like this. We have the actual PNG just embedded directly in the email, and it's its own part. It has a content type, says it's an image PNG, the file name's logo PNG, and there's our attachment ID or content ID. So that matches what we just saw in the image source. So it's kind of referencing another part in the email when you embed an image like that logo. So this is all stuff that we can parse out with Action Text and Action Mailbox in order to save this in the database and actually keep the images where they were supposed to be in the email. So we can look at these and say, okay, there is an image on line 18 that should be in the text version, and kind of more importantly, the HTML version embedded that with an image tag, and the source matches that content ID that we just saw. So what we want to be able to do is read through the HTML part, grab any images with a source where the content ID is something, look up the image attachment, and then replace it. So setting up Action Mailbox is pretty simple. You install it. There's a migration to create the Action Mailbox inbound emails model, I believe it's called. And that's where an email comes in, it gets saved to the database, and then a background job does the processing, because you don't want to slow down your Rails app with a ton of emails coming in. So it saves them to the database so you can take the time in a background job to process it for however long you need. So then we need to set up a service to process the emails for us, SendGrid, Postmark, all kinds of options there for inbound emails. And they all just basically receive the email, convert it to a webhook, and send you a post request with all the same information in it. They're all formatted a little bit differently, but Action Mailbox has several of those built in that you can use. We also need to give Action Mailbox an Ingress password, which you can see at the bottom here. So this basically is a password that you just generate, and you put it in your Action Mailbox credentials, and you put it in your service like Postmark or SendGrid. And that basically allows you to say, okay, this came actually from Postmark and someone's not spoofing it and trying to attack us. That password you keep private, and only SendGrid or Postmark or whoever knows it, and so does your Rails app. So you just match those and make sure that they're correct. And Action Mailbox does all of that for you. So then we can create mailboxes to process these emails that are coming in. We'll need one for creating a new conversation. So it's somebody who hit our support form and said, hey, I have a question about your pricing or whatever, and that should start a new ticket for conversation in your app. Now, when you reply and they reply to your email back, we need to separate that out. So we'll have a separate mailbox for replies that will find the conversation and then create the record in the database and save it. So we'll have the reply mailbox. And the way that you set up routing in these is basically you analyze the email address or headers or whatever you might want. In this example, we will set the reply email address to be conversation -ID, your database ID at whatever domain. And so we can use a regex matcher here for that and say anything that starts with conversation and has some number of digits after the hyphen and in between the at symbol, then we know that that's probably a reply, or it should be handled like a reply. Now, we don't include the actual domain here because you might have a staging domain or you want to be able to test this on localhost. So we just check for the at symbol and that's good enough. And we can ignore the domain and not worry about it, which is nice. So you can set up multiple emails and have them routed to staging.gorails.com or whatever your site is. And this is the database model I was talking about. When ActionMailbox receives a new email, it saves it in the database as an ActionMailbox inbound email record. We can pull those out of the database and call the mail method, which will actually give us a mail message object from the mail gem. And it's the same mail object that you generate when you're sending an email in your mailers. So it's kind of nice that it's exactly the same object. If you're already familiar with that, you're going to have an easy time picking out stuff from here. So we can call things like .from to grab who this email was from. And it will give us an array back because apparently an email can be from multiple people, I guess. So that's maybe one of those nuances that you don't really know until you dig into it. But it's an array, so it's not just an email address. Rails comes with the Rails conductor, which it needs more, it needs to be more functional. But this is something that I think a lot of people don't even really realize you can use in Rails. But you can go to /Rails/conductor /ActionMailbox/inbound emails /new and submit this form in development and send yourself an email that gets processed by ActionMailbox. So this is really handy for testing stuff, but it's kind of limited because if you're going to send attachments or embed stuff, you can't really do that very easily. So they have another method of doing this by delivering inbound emails by source. So you can just copy the email raw from Gmail or Hey or whatever your email client is and paste it in here along with all your attachments because they'll be just text. And you can submit that to your Rails local host and it will be able to process that. So this is the email I showed earlier that I had sent myself with the logo in it. You just paste that in here and it'll be able to replicate that. And we don't really have to go set up Postmark to talk to local hosts through ngrok or anything that complicated. We can just do this here and that'll work. So when we define a mailbox, we have to go and process the email. So we have the mail object here and we have to define a process method. So in this example, when we want to go create a new conversation because someone sent us an email to support@whatever.com, we can create a conversation with the same subject line and then create the first post, that email content that we wanted. And like we talked about, we're going to need to define the author, and that could be someone who is an employee, or it could be one of our customers or someone we've never talked to before. So we can look up in the users table, was this any one of our employees? Or we can go query the contact table and say, hey, I wasn't an employee, so we'll either find or create a user based on their email address. And if there is a display name, we can save that. So if someone's name is defined in the email address, we can keep track of that. Then also we will save on line 9 the body text, which we'll talk about in a second, because that is going to be processed by action text. And line 10 is where we just received an email, so it will have an ID, and we can save that so that if we ever process the same email twice, we could ignore it so we don't create duplicate conversations or posts for that same message. Then in our action mailbox that's shared between all the mailboxes for different emails, we can set this one up here with or some methods that are helpers that all of them might need to use. So if we add a method body here, we can actually analyze the email and say, what's the format of this email and how do we get the text out of it? And that's a easier said than done thing, because emails can be multi-part, and some parts may exist, some parts might not, may not be multi-part. And I'm sure that there's lots of ways to improve this to be more robust. But the simplest version to kind of go through is, look, if there's an HTML part, let's process the HTML and grab those image tags and replace them and actually upload those images to active storage and save that as an attachment with action text. If it's text, we'll just grab the text out of that part, decode it. And if it's not a multi-part email, we'll just grab the body of the email and decode it as well. So the attachments are interesting because we need to basically go through the email, grab all the attachments, and then upload them directly to active storage. And we hopefully will have all of those mentioned in the email, but we still probably need these attachments regardless if they're not embedded. So when we save a message, we want to save all the attachments. And we can do that by saying create after upload. So we upload the image with a string IO object because we don't have a file object. The attachment is just a string. And maybe there's a way to do that directly or whatever as well. But we save the image, the file name, and the content type and tell active storage, go upload that wherever. And then we need to basically keep that attachment so we can know the content ID. And then we have the active storage blob that we can use to look through the HTML and then say, hey, use this blob instead of that content embed. So processing the HTML looks a little bit like this. We'll take Nokogiri, we'll read through that HTML, and then we'll go through each of our attachments and scan the HTML and say, hey, is there a image with a source with the content ID that matches this content ID? So we have to go through and basically check, does that attachment even have a content ID? It could be an attachment that wasn't embedded somewhere in the HTML. We can ignore those. But if it was, we'll go grab the content ID. We'll remove the greater than, less than characters on it, and then go find any image tags that have that content ID referenced in there. Then we can define a action text attachment to replace that element with. And this is what happens with action text in your browser when you're uploading and dragging and dropping an image into that. It will go and take the image, upload it with active storage, and then give you an action text attachment HTML tag that uses a signed global ID. So those signed global IDs reference a database record, in this case, the blob. And it's signed by the Rails server, so nobody can tamper with it. So if you say this is an attachment for, for image number 1, then this is going to be verified by Rails when it renders it out and say, okay, somebody tried to change that to number 2 and it's not allowed because the signature doesn't match anymore. So that keeps it safe. So you can do user mentions or any other attachments that you might want to do with action text, and signed global IDs will keep that secure for you. And once we're done with all those attachments, we basically take the new HTML and return that back so that it can be saved with action text. So we're kind of taking what action text and tricks does on the client side in JavaScript to generate the HTML for your rich text. And we're taking the HTML out of the body of your email instead, making some edits to it, just like their JavaScript does on the client side. And then we save this as the text instead. So it's very similar to what happens on the client side. So that was a lot of talking about that, but here's what it looks like in practice. You can paste in an email with the logo, and we submit this to Rails on using the conductor in development. So we deliver that. The background job runs. It starts processing this. And then we get the image showing up immediately because of our broadcasting. And it mostly works. The partial renders, it inserts it into the page on the right browser, as you can see. And voila, we have it. But there's an image that's broken. And if we open the image, it goes to example.org, which seems a little weird because we're on localhost 3000. Well, the reason for that is because your broadcast happened in a background job, not in a regular request. So there was no host, localhost 3000, no port that it knew about. So it's going to render with the defaults, which happen to be example.org. So we can add a config line to our Rails development and tell it, hey, whenever you run a URL generator with Action Controller, use these default URL options, which is localhost port 3000, or you could probably make this dynamic or whatever to check the Rails server port and stuff. So this is what configures it so that we can actually render this partial again, and it will have the correct URL this time. Takes a second. The image is being processed by ImageMagick or whatever, being resized, and then it shows up when it's ready to be served. So the uploaded image all works now, and it's able to point to localhost. And this is something that's just kind of a, development environment situation that you're probably going to be setting default URL options in production because you want your emails to be able to send out with the correct URL anyways. So this is something that you're probably setting in production, but makes it a little weird in development when you're like, that image did not link to the right URL like I thought it would. But we now have Hotwire and ActionMailbox wired up, and Action Text as well. And it's doing some pretty cool quick magic to process an email and instantly shows up on the page. So our replies are very similar to sending a new message for a new conversation, but this is a little bit different because we need to look up a conversation instead of creating a new one. So we can add helper methods to find the conversation ID for the first step, which is line 18 and 19. This goes and looks through the recipients. So when you reply to an email, you could have 100 recipients. So we look through each one of those until we find one that matches our regex and says, oh, it's a conversation hyphen whatever. And we'll grab that ID out of there. So we'll use that regex capture group, grab that, and return that value. That goes up to line 15 where we query the database for that conversation, and then goes back to line 5 where we can create the post with the contact and the body and the email message ID. So this looks very similar to the conversation mailbox, except for we just look up a conversation instead of creating a brand new one. Then when we send emails, this is where things get interesting because we have collected these message IDs for the rest of the conversation. So like I said, every email has its own unique ID, the message ID, and we can actually tell Action Mailer to include some stuff to make our conversation emails reply to the correct email address and be organized and threaded properly in your email client. So this one, for example, will reply to a conversation. And if there's already a message ID on this post, we don't want to send it because we've already sent it. Originally, when we create the post, there will be no message ID, and we let our mailer send the email and then also save that ID. So once the email is sent, we save the ID so that we know don't ever send that email again because it's already been sent. We don't send duplicates that way. And then we can go through and set some interesting options. Like line 12, we can set the reply to address. So we can say, hey, this should go to this specific conversation when you hit the reply button. And we can BCC the recipients instead of including them all on the email. We can BCC them so that if there's a bunch of people on this email, we don't have this adding all their email addresses to it. And we can funnel the conversation through our application instead of them hitting reply all and they're getting kind of emails from each other. Make sure that all the conversations go through this. And actually, a lot of this stuff is examples that I pulled from GitHub notification emails. So this format is very similar to what they do. Then we send over the post, the conversation, as we normally would as variables. But the last two options we pass in on lines 16 and 17 collect basically the emails that we were replying to. So in reply to says, this ID is the message that we are specifically hitting reply to. And that's really useful for your email client to put it right afterwards. And then references is what helps thread it. So it says, hey, these are all the messages in this conversation. And when we send this email and you see it in your email client, group them all together. And those are the kind of 3 or 4 headers that are really useful for defining properly in your emails so that Action Mailbox and everything can be nicely integrated there. And the way that works is, we already gathered those IDs and we put them through to the mailer. So we just set them as headers and that's it. We set up our BCC, our 2 headers, and we're good to go. So nothing too fancy here. And then this allows us to reply to a conversation in our app. That's going to send an email out. And then on the left side, I actually have an example email that replies to this conversation number 2. And I don't show it here in the screenshot. I wish I did, but you can see that when we route that email, it finds conversation number 2 and replies that inside of our application automatically. So it just shows up right there after being processed by Action Mailbox. And then we can just reply in app that would send another email, or client could reply with another email and continue the conversation. So that is kind of at a high level what you can do with Hotwire and Action Mailbox and Action Text. But there's a lot of changes that have kind of happened as well in the recent weeks. There's a lot of stuff that you can do as well with Hotwire for mobile apps. But there's also now lots of new JavaScript stuff that request.js you can use on your client side to use turbo streams in your responses for that instead of making Rails.ajax requests and so on. And Rails 7 is going to be giving you all of these features out of the box. So I'm really excited about all this, and it really allows you to do something like this we didn't really even write any JavaScript. We got a rich text. We got real-time updates happening in our app, and we didn't write any JavaScript, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot you can do with this, and it's just a really exciting time in the Rails community, which is awesome. So yeah, that's kind of my talk.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let's all give a round of applause for this talk. So now it's going to be a bit tricky because we're going to open the Q&A, but we have one microphone here and people in Zoom. We're going to try and answer one question from the audience in our office, and then someone from Zoom, if that's okay. You can also ask questions in Zoom's chat, so we can read them later. And if you don't get a chance to ask something to Chris right now, you can do it later on Twitter. I hope he'll probably answer.
Yep.
So,
yep.
Is there any question in the audience? Don't leave me hanging, guys. You're gonna leave me hanging. So do we have any questions in Zoom? I can ask a question because but because my background isn't technical, I'm going to ask you about the GoRails community. So
Sure.
how is that experience? What have you learned while developing GoRails what have you learned about the community, about the Ruby community?
Yeah, that's a good
Only the good
question.
parts. Only the good parts.
Yeah. I think what I love the most about the community is like, there's a strong community that loves entrepreneurship and being able to build stuff with very small teams. Like this project we just kind of walked through, you could do that in an hour with one person pretty easily. And I think the community is just really supportive, helping each other learn these things and build cool stuff, but also not getting too in the weeds of, you know, I don't know. There's just a lot of new stuff that everybody's hype about, and they leave for another language and whatever. And I feel like the Rails community and Ruby community in general has a love for writing code that's elegant, that can accomplish a lot with a lot of um, you know, with small teams and everything. And I think that is the thing that I just continually find the community so helpful for with each other. And so it's been a blast. There's so many awesome people that I've met through the screencasts and everything. And yeah, thank you guys for all your support.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me? Am I muted? No.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Questions, anyone? Do we have anyone with a question on Zoom?
Andrew has a question. If I'm doing any podcasts, and Andrew is my co-host on the Remote Ruby podcast. So tune in if you want to hear us talk more about this kind of stuff every week.
Cool. You have a question?
I actually have a question. Thank you for the talk. Are you building any new projects, or is it just this?
Yeah. So at the moment, I've been working on a lot of payments related stuff for Jumpstart Pro, and we've been exploring basically the thing I would like to do more of is the iOS and Android, and you can even build desktop like an Electron wrapper around your Hotwire apps. So that's one of those things that I'm going to probably be working on a lot more in the next few months, and kind of learning how to set all those things up and organize them well, because I think it's super awesome that, Basecamp can go build Basecamp's mobile apps, and hey, mobile apps with like 2 mobile developers originally or whatever, one for Android, one for iOS. And I'm sure the teams are bigger now, but it's impressive to be able to build a cross-platform app with a very small team. So I think those are ones that don't get enough attention, and I would like to work on that, learn some more about it, and hopefully share more stuff on how to build apps with those things. I think that will be a pretty fun project to do over the next few months.
Anyone else?
Sorry, I just have a last question. I mean, this is kind of a follow-up. What do you see is the future for Ruby?
Can you mute your microphone so that we don't have so much okay, thank you. So you asked what was the future for Ruby? Okay. How do you see Ruby going?
The future for Ruby? Yeah, I think it's going to be really good. I've always thought that over time, like in the beginning, early days of computing, basically, we had to write code that the computer understood first and foremost. And Ruby and basically a few other languages, but seemingly very few, are optimizing for humans to understand the code first. So I think long term, we'll see more and more out of Ruby or other languages like it that optimized for like developer happiness and speed and understanding. So I think Ruby is only going to get way, way better. There's a lot of performance stuff happening, which helps in the meantime, but computers will always get faster. So we should spend more time building stuff in languages like Ruby, where humans are probably the slowest part of computers. So if we can make that more understandable, more readable, and easier to use, that's going to be the future. Where people have talked about being able to drag and drop code, and there's a lot of people building no code or low code things, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of edge cases and stuff. So you're probably still going to have to write code at some point. So I think Ruby's approach to programming is only going to get way more important over time. So it's a big reason why I'm still, in the Rails and Ruby community, because I think it's more about us as human beings writing code, at least for the future. Maybe AI gets really good and can replace us all, but then we'll have a lot of big questions to solve then.
So João Reis is asking on Zoom, more interesting features in Rails 7.
Yeah, there are a bunch of interesting things. Nick Schwaderer had a post earlier that was talking about a few of those. And I forget the entire list, but there are some good ones in there that like you can run database queries concurrently during your rendering of views, which is neat. So you can actually do 2 slow queries at the same time, and it'll be faster because Rails isn't going to be able to do those in parallel, which is cool. A lot of the JavaScript and CSS stuff, I think, will be people's biggest change in Rails 7. Webpacker is going to be an option, but yeah, I think over the last week I played with this a little bit, and I converted some Webpacker CSS with Tailwind and all the JavaScript that ran through Babel and everything else. And now my JavaScript compiles in 0.2 seconds, and the Tailwind stuff compiles in like 1 second, compared to like in production, sometimes it would take minutes to compile all of that stuff. And this will basically be the exact same speed as it will be in production. So I'm very, very optimistic, and it's really improved. I think it kind of gives Rails has less control over it and says, hey, use whatever you want, which is nice because we can use, ES build, which is super quick, or directly use the Tailwind UI that they support the most and most people use. So it is, it's very welcome. I think after all this time of being unsure of how do we do JavaScript and CSS, we're now getting some good answers to that. The import maps are also an interesting option. It looked like Basecamp just switched back to use ES build instead of maybe import maps. You get a bit more control over your dependencies with a JavaScript bundler instead of import maps, which is the main thing. But I think Rails 7 is going to ship with import maps still as the default, which is good for very lightweight, minimal JavaScript. There's a ton of other really good Rails features that came out too, but I'm forgetting all of those. It's too many to list, I feel like.
Okay, so more questions? Okay.
Chris, I have a question.
Sure.
So now we are using Hotwire for messaging system. So in that future, upcoming versions, I mean Ruby on Rails versions. So are we going with the completely two-way communication?
What was the question again?
Yeah, I mean,
we can't hear because of the interference. You probably have to mute your sound. Because we're getting, okay, can you ask the question again? If you can't use the mic, just type it in Zoom's chat Maybe that's.
Yeah,
Now-
that'll work.
In the meantime, we have a
That's
question over
better.
here.
Hey, Chris. Sorry, it might be a silly question, but I know that Rails already have like the view to handle like the HTML and everything. And do you see Rails joining with any of like the front end frameworks like PHP did with like Vue? Can you see like Rails joining in with like React to get it bigger?
I don't imagine so. I think DHH is not a fan of them. And they also don't work really well with you can't pair them well
thing.
with Turbo. So I think that's kind of the thing that Rails probably won't adopt those because they need to be sort of compatible with Turbo. So chances are it will be Turbo and Stimulus for the most part. But if you are interested in React and Inertia or in Vue, check out Inertia. And basically, that is trying to merge the ideas between Turbo and like Hotwire in a way with Vue.js or React. And the way that it works is like the navigation is still done by Rails, and the Rails views, instead of rendering HTML or forcing your JavaScript to download JSON from everything, you can actually have your Rails views render the Vue components and the JSON as props right inside your Rails app. So your Rails app gets to control all of the navigation and what is rendered still, but your client side just says, here's the component I want to render on this page, and we'll boot it up. So it's like a really nice balance between the two, where you don't have to go full on SPA and write just a JSON API backend. You can get the benefits of both. You can use session cookies and all of that for logging in users, but you get to use React or Vue on the front end, which is a great balance. And that's a project by one of the guys who created Tailwind and just joined Tailwind as a full-time employee. So I imagine he will have more time to work on that in the future, which is cool. So
Any more questions? Oh, Hemant has one. So when are we coming with fully two-way rendering like React and Angular?
That's a good question. I think Rails is going to keep the rendering only on the server side intentionally. Hotwire stands for HTML over the wire. So the idea is that you have all these nice Rails helpers like pluralization and internationalization and number to currency and whatever. And you can just let Rails deal with all that and have it render the templates and minimal JavaScript. And that way you're going to take care of all of those helpers on the Rails side. Because if you do want to run React or Vue or something, you're going to have to kind of rebuild a lot of those helpers in JavaScript. And one of the downsides is that your device that your app runs on could be a mobile phone that's 5 years old, or it could be a really high performance desktop computer or something. And the more JavaScript you have, your app could be slower or faster depending on what device it runs on. But if it's all kind of rendered by Rails, it'll always be fast because your server is going to be fast. So you're kind of more than reliant on the network connection, but with the client side, you're dependent on the network connection and the device speed. And it's also simpler to write an application with just your backend code for the most part. So I imagine that will not be a high priority for them to do that kind of stuff, but you never know.
Any more questions? No. Okay, so any more questions on Zoom? Anyone? So Sajan is asking, any experience or suggestions for migrating Monolith Rails app to microservices?
I think a lot of people go that route, and it adds a lot of complexity. So I'd try not to if you can. But yeah, I haven't personally done a ton of that because I've intentionally tried to avoid microservices. You have a lot more orchestration to manage the connections between all those and deploying everything in sync, so that if you deploy a new dependency, it needs to be backwards compatible unless you're going to deploy both at the same time. And then it's kind of like, probably a lot easier if you could keep it as a monolith. But there's a new Rails book. I forget the name of it. Someone will have to find it, but there's a new one on that talks about running microservices in production. And that would be the book I would tell you to go read on that, because I think it has a lot of good real world experience that it covers in there. It sounded like. I'll have to find the name of that.
Okay. Any more questions, anyone? Anyone else wants to ask something to Chris right now? Okay, so one last one. About node modules. As we are moving to use node modules, this use some extra space in repo.
No, that shouldn't, because basically you don't include the node modules in your repo. You should ignore them. And then when you install your app on your computer, you run yarn or npm to install the node modules, and production will do the same thing during a deploy. So no, it shouldn't take any extra space because you shouldn't have them in your repo. So
okay, maybe if there's any question after this, feel free to reach out to Chris on Twitter. His handle is @excid3, just like his GitHub username, right?
Yep. Pretty much everywhere.
You're the same everywhere. So thank you everyone for joining us. Don't forget that Sardines is coming back in October, on the 14th of October at around 6 p.m. Just like today. We'll probably keep this hybrid format. We still don't know. Stay tuned. The speaker will be Daniel Magliola. He's a senior staff engineer at Indeed Flex, and his talk is entitled "The Regex's Dream of Turing Completeness." Very cryptic and mysterious. So stay tuned. More details are coming soon about the October Sardines. So if anyone wants to give a talk or know someone that does on some of the next editions of Sardines, feel free to get in touch. Drop us a line on Meetup or send us a message on Runtime social media accounts. We are always glad to have more speakers. And that's pretty much it. Thank you everyone for joining us, and see you next time.